Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, we will be looking once again at History of Political Philosophy, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. If you're a listener of the show, you know we've come back to this book several times to discuss various essays regarding political philosophers throughout history. Most recently, I looked at the essay in here about Plato, and today we're going to look at the essay about Aristotle. This essay is by Carnes Lord, and the earlier editions had a different chapter on Aristotle, but it was revised for the third edition. And they're not very specific on exactly why this one was replaced. They replaced several of them. They replaced a couple of the chapters, it looks like, in the second edition. And then they replaced a couple of chapters again in the third edition. And this was one of them. So, regardless of why they took the old one out and put this one in, this is the one I have. I have the third edition from 1987. And that's the one we'll be looking at today. So, this being a book of political philosophy, we don't get an awful lot of detail about Aristotle's more general philosophical ideas, his metaphysical ideas, his examination of science and logic. We really focus on ethics and politics in this essay, which is fine. That's the aspects of Aristotle that I think I am most interested in. Although all of his philosophy is interesting, this is, I think, the most interesting to me, probably the most important for my purpose, is a look at his political writings. So, like in all my episodes, I'm going to be reading a couple sections here. Actually, I have quite a bit that I want to read from this episode. I want to take a nice deep look at this essay and a couple of important ideas of Aristotle's about politics and ethics. I think that he is a great thinker, and in some sense, he's a forerunner, I think, of some of the ideas of common sense philosophy. And his political and ethical writing is very different from some of his other writings. I think that some of his other writings don't stand up as well. He made great strides in advancing science and physics, but this is like 2,500 years ago, and we know so much more now than we did then, that a lot of his writings, I don't think, hold up to the test of time. They're not as applicable today when you're talking about some of his scientific ideas as they were back then. It's interesting, and it's definitely food for thought, and maybe some aspects of what he's writing about have some truth to them. But I think his ethics and his politics have withstood the test of time much better, given what we now know about the nature of reality. What we know about people and their motivations and how people get along with one another and what people do to try to make themselves happy and try to live successful, happy lives among other people in coordination with one another to form societies. Sometimes I wonder whether we know less now than we used to. We've gotten a hold of a lot of ideological mind viruses, if you will, that pertain to how people relate to one another and what our purpose is here on Earth. And we've got all kinds of ideas, and so many of them have proven to be not very accurate, not very helpful, even harmful ideas. So in this regard, his writings are, I think, just as valid as anything that anyone has written recently. We really have made very little progress in the realm of political theory from Aristotle to the present. And so that's what I want to read about, and that's what this essay is about more so than anything else because of the nature of the book. But that's why I'm excited about reading this section. I think it points out some of Aristotle's ideas that I think we should really take to heart in the modern world, and our political systems could probably benefit from taking some insight from Aristotle about the best way to form a political society. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and start reading here a little bit about politics as a practical science, which is really what makes Aristotle's approach so interesting. He says, quote, Aristotle's writings tend to be approached generally as straightforward attempts to present a purely scientific or theoretical account of their subject matter. Yet it is far from clear that the ethical and political treatises can be safely viewed in this light. Aristotle indicates that there is a fundamental difference between theoretical sciences, which are pursued for the sake of knowledge, and practical sciences, which are pursued principally for the sake of the benefits deriving from them. Politics is, for Aristotle, the practical science par excellence. It is necessary at the outset to understand the scope and intention of practical or political science as Aristotle conceives it, both for the sake of a proper appreciation of the literary character of Aristotle's ethical and political writings, and in order to grasp the problematic role in Aristotle's thought of political philosophy as such. While the distinction between theoretical and practical science is nowhere systematically developed by Aristotle, it would appear that these modes of knowledge differ fundamentally in their method and the intellectual faculty they engage, as well as in their objects and purpose. The objects of theoretical science are things not subject to change, or things of which the principle of change lies in themselves. Its method is analysis of the principles or causes of these things. Its purpose is demonstrative knowledge, and its faculty is the scientific or theoretical portion of the rational part of the soul. The theoretical sciences recognized by Aristotle include metaphysics or theology, mathematics, physics, biology, and psychology. Practical science, by contrast, is concerned exclusively with man, or with man in his capacity as a self-conscious being or a source of action or praxis. Because, or to the extent that it depends on human volition, human action is essentially subject to change. The purpose of practical science is not knowledge, but the betterment of action. Its proper faculty is the calculative or practical segment of the rational part of the soul, what Aristotle terms practical wisdom or prudence, or phronesis. As for the method of practical science, Aristotle appears to conceive it as a mode of analysis designed less to discover the principles or causes than to articulate the phenomena of human action, in large part through a dialectical examination and refinement of men's opinions concerning these phenomena. Aristotle's frequent reliance throughout his political writings on dialectical argumentation, that is, on a quasi-conversational mode of inquiry that begins from the premises embedded in common opinion, reveals a kinship in spirit, if not form, with the Platonic dialogue. Like Plato and the Platonic Socrates, Aristotle locates the proper beginning point of political philosophy in the language and opinions of ordinary men. He does not proceed by deduction from immutable principles of human nature, nor does he attempt to establish a logically rigorous technical vocabulary that is remote from actual political life. Part of the reason for this lies in Aristotle's insistence that the same precision is not to be sought in the practical or political sphere as in the theoretical sciences. Human things are inherently variable, and to approach them in the spirit of the physicist or mathematician seeking to discover universal laws is to distort fundamentally the relevant phenomena. The kind of reasoning that is appropriate in dealing with political matters is closer to the practical or prudential reasoning of the ordinary citizen, rooted as it is in the particulars of everyday experience, than to the deductive reasoning of the scientist or philosopher. End quote. So we start off with a couple basic important points about how Aristotle approaches politics. The first thing that really jumps out at me is how, first of all, there's a separation between theoretical science and practical science. They're not the same thing, and they're not approached in the same way, for the same reason, or using the same methods. They're just sort of different. And too much of political theory, at least in the Enlightenment era, was an attempt to come up with laws and systems and rationalize practical science and turn it into some sort of theoretical science, or at least propose that a theoretical science was possible and maybe even just around the corner, instead of just allowing them to the practical and the theoretical to just exist as two different types of thought, different types of science, I guess, different types of study. The other thing that jumps out at me is how practical science is not for the purpose of knowledge. It's not for the purpose of acquiring knowledge. Theoretical science is the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. Practical science always comes back to deploying that science, deploying that knowledge in action, or praxis, which is the Greek term. And the Greek term for practical wisdom or prudence is phronesis, and this is the part of the human mind that engages in practical science and practical philosophy and politics and ethics. This is good judgment. It's much more intuitive than theoretical science. It's much more particular. It's not a seeking after of universal laws that can be applied, but it's a case-by-case basis, being able to judge constantly changing scenarios. He does talk about how the human situation, the political situation, is always subject to change. It's not after the universals, and it's not expected to always have a ready-made answer at hand. Every situation is different, and so because the situation is constantly changing, on the one hand, there are sort of principles, universal principles that you can at least bring to bear, like the sense that you should, I don't know, let's say, generally speaking, you should respect your elders. Let's call that a basic principle or virtue or value. But circumstances always get a say. Sometimes your elders aren't good people. Sometimes your parents aren't good people. And sometimes it comes to pass that your elders make bad decisions, and you have to overrule them. So while there is a sort of a baseline, it's always subject to change. It's always presented with all sorts of caveats. It's just very, very much a case-by-case basis. It always points to action. It always exists. We study ethics, we study politics because we live in the world and we have to deploy our ethical knowledge and our political knowledge in our day-to-day affairs because we're trying to live with other people who are themselves trying to make decisions about the world. And so there has to be a constant judgment of, are you going to agree with other people? Are you going to disagree with them? Are you going to stand against them? Are you going to coordinate with them? Life is always churning and ongoing, and the political realm is a realm that is there's always new problems arising. There's always new situations, and there are also always echoes of the past. They say history repeats itself. It doesn't, right? But it rhymes. You get echoes of things from the past, but you can't live as if every situation is just like the past, and therefore the solution that we applied to yesterday's problem can also be applied to today's problem. And the other thing that I think here is really interesting is how he says that Aristotle locates the proper beginning point of political philosophy in the language and opinions of ordinary men. And he says that Plato and the Platonic Socrates do this as well. However, there's a distinct difference. I think that Socrates, as Plato presents him, always seems to pick apart the common ideas. He doesn't have deep, abiding respect for the common man's ideas. They're sort of common men think they know something, and then Socrates will kind of prove to them that they don't really know. What is a friend? Oh, I know what a friend is. And then let's talk for a little while. And then you come away from the conversation, oh, now I find that I don't know what a friend is after talking to Socrates. What is justice? I thought I knew, but now I don't know anymore because I talked to Socrates and he picked everything apart. And he had a contradiction to every type of answer I attempted to put forward, so that everything that I thought is no longer true, but no new substitute has come about. So the way that they approach the knowledge of the common man is not the same at all. There's definitely, Aristotle has a respect for the common man, and while he may say that common ideas maybe aren't as developed as they could be, they aren't as refined, they haven't taken everything into consideration, Aristotle also says that if everybody says something, then it can be the case that everybody's wrong. Certainly it has been the case in the past, and everybody has believed something, and they've all been wrong. But on the whole, if a bunch of people believe in something, it's probably true, or there's probably some truth to it, or there's probably some reason why they believe that. And it should only be discarded as a belief for a reason. It should only be discarded as a belief after it's been analyzed, after it's been subject to scrutiny and proven that it doesn't hold weight in the same, like the way that Socrates does, but a much more rigorous dismantling would be required. It can't just be brushed aside with wordplay. The ideas of the common people are a sort of foundation upon which political ideas can be developed and built. And so I think that Aristotle has a much greater respect for the ideas of the common man. And so there's two things I see here. I see a forerunner of common sense philosophy, and I see a forerunner of pragmatism. The ideas are only so valuable insofar as they provide a benefit to the people who are practicing them. You study politics, you study ethics in order to deploy what you know in action in the real world to have consequences, to get the result that you're after, not just to know on its own, in its own sort of world of knowledge that doesn't really ever meet the practical real world of experience. For Aristotle, knowledge about politics, knowledge about ethics, knowledge about practical science specifically is action-based, and so it's kind of pragmatic. But he also puts forward, there's this other type of science, which is theoretical science, which is more in the realm of just learning in order to know, trying to know the truth. But that always winds up, getting deployed anyway. Everything that we learn about the world ultimately gets deployed in one form or another through technology or through, maybe it comes back to politics in a roundabout way. But most things that we learn about the world will, in one way or another, get deployed or at least influence the decisions that we make. So even the theoretical science doesn't point quite as clearly to knowledge and knowledge alone, I think, as Aristotle might insinuate here. But anyway, let's keep moving from there. Shortly afterwards, he introduces the concept of eudaimonia that we talked about in the last episode. He says, quote, "Every art and inquiry, and similarly every action and intentional choice, is held to aim at some good." The very first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics reflects Aristotle's concern to establish the scope and dignity of political science. Just as all our actions aim ultimately at a determinate end, which is desired for its own sake rather than for the sake of anything beyond itself, so the various arts and sciences can be understood as being ultimately subordinate to a single master science, which encompasses the comprehensive human good. But this master science is evidently political expertise or political science, for it is political expertise that makes a determination as to which sciences are needed in cities, which are to be learned by which sorts of persons, and up to what point. And we see that even the capacities most held in honor are subordinate to it, such as generalship, household management, and rhetoric. Since it uses the other sciences, and since it legislates as to what should be done and what avoided, its end would encompass those of the others, and this would be the human good. The dignity of political expertise is reflected as much in the authority it exercises over all forms of human knowledge, it seems, as in its role in legislation. That a concern for the human good inevitably involves consideration of law, and that the city is initially taken for granted by Aristotle, even if the good of the individual and the good of the city are the same, that of the city is evidently greater, nobler, or more complete. These are the things aimed at by our inquiry, which is thus a sort of political expertise. The good, or the good life, for men individually, and for the political community is the overarching theme of Aristotelian political science. Aristotle begins his inquiry by pursuing the question of the nature of the comprehensive human good. He has little difficulty identifying this good as well-being or happiness or eudaimonia. When it comes to specifying the content of happiness, however, it appears that there is disagreement, both among ordinary people and between ordinary people and the wise, intellectuals, or philosophers. Indeed, there are people who identify happiness with different things at different times, according to their preoccupation of the moment. Yet Aristotle does not draw the conclusion, characteristic of modern liberal thought, that happiness, as distinct from the instruments or conditions of happiness, is therefore fundamentally subjective, or resistant to politically useful definition. Aristotle is satisfied that there is, in fact, a large measure of agreement as to the nature of happiness, and that the disagreements regarding it are non-arbitrary reflections of fundamental aspects of the human condition. For Aristotle, there are essentially three ways of life available to human beings: the life of pleasure, the political life, and the theoretical or philosophical life. A life centering on the pleasures of the body is the life led by most men, by many of those favored by fortune as well as by ordinary persons. Men of a more refined sort, on the other hand, hold honor to be the end of life, and seek it through the display of their virtue in political action. Finally, a few men pursue the pleasures deriving from pure intellectual activity. Contrary to what one might expect, Aristotle does not undertake to adjudicate this dispute. He merely dismisses the claim of the life of pleasure, and he proceeds to elaborate a definition of happiness which seems deliberately intended to blur the difference between the political and the theoretical life. End quote. So we have here something sort of similar to the last episode when we're talking about eudaimonia and happiness and what it is that makes people happy, what sorts of happiness there are. And there's the fact that there's a dispute among different people about what really constitutes happiness. And here he identifies three types of happiness: the life of pleasure, the political life, and the philosophical life. And the author here seems to indicate, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, in my recollections of Aristotle, I seem to feel like he really elevated the philosophical as the highest of these. But for purposes of argument, let's say that he really does sort of blur the lines between the philosophical life and the political life. I think if you were to look to Plato, you'd find that Plato definitely elevates the philosophical life above the political life. But let's say that both political and philosophical activity are involved in happiness. And he points the political sort of to glory. People who seek glory do so through the political realm. But I think that he probably shouldn't dismiss pleasure quite so quickly. In my opinion, there are totally legitimate pleasures in this life that comes from your sensations. Looking upon beautiful works of art, looking at the beauty of nature is a physical sensation that is pleasing to the eye. Eating good food and listening to good music, these are sensations that are pleasurable. And there's nothing wrong or lower, I don't feel, about those things. I think they're critical components to a good, happy life, to live in some amount of pleasure. But I think that often it's the case that as soon as we start thinking of the life of pleasure, we start envisioning someone who lives only for pleasure. And when we think of someone who lives only for physical pleasures and doesn't stop to think about anything deeper than that, we can't help but feel some sort of a scorn for such a person who doesn't have anything that he really stands for, nothing that he would fight for, nothing that he would kill for, nothing that he would die for, nothing that he would experience displeasure, displeasurable phenomena for. No good reason to feel bad things or to feel down about. And that seems a little shallow to us. So I think we too readily discount this because we immediately envision someone who's way off balance in that direction. But I think the best place to be is sort of balanced. And I think that's a real the real Aristotelian, in my eye, the real Aristotelian way of understanding happiness is that all the different components are necessary. Some amount of material prosperity, right? Some amount of family, some amount of friends, some amount of virtue in your activities, something to feel proud about, some aspect of the political life, some philosophical contemplation. The things that make a life full and rich and worth living are multitudinous. But I do think it's interesting how he says that politics is essentially the master science, because all other sciences and what they do and who's going to do them and how much effort will be spent on them are decisions that are made, at least in some sense, at the political level. What sort of a society are we going to have? What sort of sciences will we pursue? How important is science to our society? This is essentially a political question. And so politics is aiming at the good of the people, the individual people that constitute a society, as well as the good of the society as a whole. Now, if you're a hardcore individualist, you might say there's no such thing as the good of the society as a whole, just the good of the individuals that comprise it. But that would assume that a society could simply dismantle itself and provide absolutely nothing to the next generation. If you believe that society as a whole has its own ends and its own well-being, a society as a whole has its own sort of eudaimonia, that's the sort of mentality that you would have to believe that you have an obligation to leave your society in a better state than you found it. That you gain a society, you inherit a society from your parents. They've given this to you. They've worked their best to perfect the society, and all the generations that have come before you have worked to build a good society and give it to you, and then you have an obligation, because you've received this, you have an obligation also to bequeath a society to your offspring that is at least as good, if not better, than the one that you received from your ancestors. If society is only just an aggregate of the individual desires and will and well-being and the individual eudaimonias of all of the individual constituent people at any given time, then they would really have no obligation, because the unborn, the next generation, the next 5-10 generations can't make their case. They can't engage in a trade of some sort to get a good society from you, and they give you something in return. You just have an obligation to them, the future generations. And why do you have an obligation to them? Because you have an obligation to your society, because society has its own interests, and you as a member of society have to devote some amount of effort towards the interests of your society and not just your own interests. Without a society having its own interests above and separate from the interests of the constituent members, then a society really has no cohesion at all. Let's move on from there, where he introduces a couple of other ideas, and those ideas primarily relate to arete. He says, quote, "In seeking a definition of happiness that will command broad agreement, Aristotle steps back momentarily from the commonly expressed opinions regarding happiness to the more general and theoretical issue of the nature of man and his proper work or function, or ergon. What is distinctive about man is his rational soul, in the double form of an element that possesses reason, or thinks, and an element that is obedient to reason. The proper function of man is therefore the putting to work, or activity, or energeia, of the soul in accordance with reason, or rather, the most excellent form of such activity. Happiness, or the human good, can be defined then as activity of the soul in accordance with excellence or virtue, or arete, and, if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most perfect. Aristotle denies emphatically that there is a conflict between happiness so defined and pleasure. Those who habitually perform virtuous or noble actions take pleasure in doing so, for such actions are pleasant by nature. Nevertheless, the link between virtue and happiness is qualified in several important respects. Aristotle admits that it is difficult or impossible to act virtuously or to attain happiness without a modicum of external goods. These include not only some amount of wealth, friends, and political power, but also children, good birth, and even good looks. A man who is very ugly in appearance or ill-born, or who lives by himself and has no children, is not apt to be particularly happy, and perhaps still less, someone whose children and friends are thoroughly vicious or were good but have died. Aristotle wrestles at length with the question whether a good man, exposed to extreme suffering, can, in any case, be considered happy. And he acknowledges the common view, that in the final analysis, happiness is a plaything of fortune or a gift of the gods. While he rejects such notions, Aristotle is clearly alive to those aspects of the human situation that necessarily limit any individual or collective effort to secure happiness. He appears to find no merit in an alternative that would concentrate on securing the material conditions of happiness in preference to fostering the virtues that are constitutive of happiness as he understands it. At least part of the reason for this would seem to lie in Aristotle's conviction, shared by all political thinkers of classical antiquity, that wealth is less important as an external condition of happiness than human relationships, which are critically dependent on virtue. This conviction in turn reflects Aristotle's fundamental view that man is by nature a social or political animal. End quote. Okay, so there's a couple things in there to take note of. And the first that I will mention is the early point that he makes when he's talking about what is the nature of man and his proper work or function in order to figure out what it is that man should do and what virtue is. He says what's distinctive about man is his rational soul. And so this is something that I always sort of feel a little bit uncomfortable with as a notion because it doesn't add up to me. So mankind has a rational soul, and that is what is distinctive about him. And so therefore, really what defines man is his rationality. And his virtue is acting in accord with reason. He says the proper function of man is therefore the putting to work or activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Because reason is what is distinctive. He says what is distinctive about man is his rational soul. The proper function of man is therefore putting to work or activity of the soul in accordance with reason. But why is the proper activity of man pursuing that which is distinct to man? That seems like a bit of a leap because one other thing, right? I mean, might sound strange, but humans, what is distinctive about humans is the fact that they have hair on the top of their head, but nowhere else on their body. You know, obviously we have hair on our body, but we don't grow hair like we do on our heads. We can grow long locks of hair on top of our head. The rest of our body cannot do that. And other animals, they grow fur, but they don't grow long. They don't grow like we can grow hair if we wanted to that could be feet long, 5, 6, 7 feet long hair on top of our heads. And other animals can't do this. So you might say that one of the things that is distinctive about humans is that we have hair on top of our heads, that is, whereas the rest of our body is relatively devoid of hair by comparison. And we stand upright on 2 legs, and most animals don't do that. And so that's sort of distinctive. So would you then be able to say that, therefore, the proper activity of mankind is the cultivation of a head of long, luxurious hair? Just because it's a distinctive quality of humans doesn't necessarily mean that that is the purpose of humans. We are rational creatures, and therefore rationality is what's distinctive. And so if we are pursuing our function, we are behaving rationally. But if a computer an artificial intelligence is able to behave rationally as well, then perhaps at that point it no longer becomes distinctive. It's merely distinctive about humans because there's no other animal that does it. But if there was another animal that was as reasonable and rational as we were, would that no longer be distinctive? And at that point, would that no longer be our purpose, to behave in such a way? It doesn't really add up that just because something is distinctive about mankind, that therefore becomes our purpose. Our purpose is really, of course, the same purpose as every other living creature, which is to replicate our genetic code through the process of survival and procreation, to create as many copies of the various elements of our genetic code as possible through having children and through advancing the interests of other people who share copies or partial copies of our genetic code. That's the purpose of human beings, and rather than being distinctive, it's a purpose that we share with all other animals. It doesn't add up that just because we are uniquely rational, rationality therefore can settle into the position of being what our number one priority is. And I'm not saying that that's exactly what Aristotle says, but this does become something that comes up for philosophers, especially of the ancient world. If I reread this section in the beginning, you can see that is sort of what he's saying when he says he steps back from the commonly expressed opinions about happiness to the more general, theoretical issue of the nature of man and his proper work or function. What is distinctive about man is his rational soul in the double form of an element that possesses reason, or thinks, and an element that is obedient to reason. The proper function of man is therefore the putting to work or activity of the soul in accordance with reason, or rather the most excellent form of such activity. Happiness, or the human good, can be defined then as activity of the soul in accordance with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most perfect. So this last sentence, he jumps from the main function being the putting to work of the soul in accordance with reason, or rather the most excellent form of such activity, and then jumps to excellence or virtue. Activity of the soul with excellence or virtue. And I suppose that excellence or virtue is determined as the most excellent form of such activity, the most excellent form of reason. Not just a reason on its own, but a prioritized and perfected form of reason is really what we're after. But excellence and virtue as arete, and the best and most perfect, if there are several virtues, doesn't necessarily point back to reason. There's no reason that it should. There are a whole host of virtues that people can have, and it doesn't add up that reason should be able to be considered the top most important virtue we can have. That's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I see that. But he does reiterate here how there are other things that are necessary. You're going to have a hard time being happy if you're beastly ugly, if you have no children, or other circumstances have not gone well for you. And sometimes it's just fate. If you're born crippled, if you're born devastatingly poor, if you're born an orphan, or other things that could happen if the people you love die through no fault of your own. Things just happen, and sometimes it's hard to be happy, and there's nothing but fate that has decreed it. But he says essentially that what's the most important thing for being happy is to have good relationships with other people. And those relationships are, in fact, dependent on virtue. So while there are certain circumstances that can make you unhappy, you can't really achieve happiness unless you engage in the sort of virtues that will allow you to have friends, that will cause other people to like you. And if you behave in virtuous ways that would prompt other people to want to have relationships with you, then you will be more happy than someone who cultivates the sort of habits that drive other people away. So there's a sort of instrumental quality to these virtues here. It's not necessarily, at least in this description, just that having virtues is its own benefit, its own good, and brings pleasure on its own just by practicing them. Although that is something that he says, he also says that there's a goal in being virtuous, and the goal is to get along with other people. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Both make a lot of sense. There's a sort of good feeling that you get when you act virtuously, when you do good things, whether that means that you act courageously, or you act wisely, or you act prudently, or you behave in a way that is generally rewarding, kind or courageous or whatever it may be. You feel good about it. And so there's a value in it for its own sake, but there's also a benefit. And one has to wonder how much the intrinsic value of virtue is actually some sort of hardwired evolutionary response to activity that is more likely to lead you to genetic success. So there are many more interesting sections here, but I want to jump forward a little bit to where he talks about different types of regimes that a city or political unit can take. So here he says, quote, Aristotle's analysis of regimes is presented initially in a schematic and, as is soon apparent, highly simplified form. All regimes have as their governing element either one, few, or many persons, and their aim is either the common good of the city as a whole or the private advantage of the rulers. There are then 6 basic types of regime. Kingship is the correct form of one man or monarchic rule, tyranny the deviant form. Rule of the few takes the form either of aristocracy, so called either because the best persons are ruling, or because they are ruling with view to what is best for the city and for those who participate in it, or oligarchy. And the rule of the multitude in its deviant form is democracy, while the correct form is called, by the term common to all regimes, polity or politeia. Aristotle makes clear at once, however, that the basis for the distinction between regimes is not simply numbers. The essential difference between democracy and oligarchy is not the size of the ruling element, but, rather, wealth or its absence. Oligarchy is the rule of the wealthy, who also generally happen to be few, and democracy the rule of the poor, who are generally the majority. The difference is fundamental, because it rests on essentially differing ways of life and conceptions of political justice. Oligarchs and democrats agree on the principle of distributive justice, that equal persons should receive equal things, but they disagree as to what constitutes equality in persons. The former believe that inequality in wealth justifies unequal treatment generally. The latter, that equality in freedom requires equal treatment in all respects. It should be noted that the many do not rest their claim to political justice simply on their status as human beings or free men. The equality embodied in the Democrats' claim reflects an equality of risk in defense of the city from its enemies. This claim to justice in the name of military virtue is particularly clear in the case of polity, where the right to bear heavy arms is virtually the definition of the governing body. Indeed, it would seem to be above all the city's military requirements that explain its tendency to be a partnership of free and equal persons, and they explain at least in part its tendency to develop in the direction of popular rule. Aristotle reminds us that the claims of the competent groups in the city to political justice are most properly judged in terms of their respective contribution to the end of the city. The difficulty is that the politically most powerful groups in the city, the many and the wealthy few, have a much stronger claim to contributing to the means of happiness or virtue than to happiness or virtue as such. Does this mean, then, that authority in the city can be justly claimed by the respectable element, that is, by gentlemen who are bred to virtue? Aristotle does not deny the strength of their claim. He simply asserts that the exclusive rule of such men would deprive all other claimants of the honors or prerogatives they regard as their due. He He then appears to suggest that the participation in rule of the other claimants is a matter of expedience rather than right. In the immediate sequel, however, Aristotle states at greater length the case for the claim of the many, and in so doing shows that there is an important sense in which the many are able to dispute the claim of the gentleman on its own grounds. While none of the many individually may be fully excellent, Aristotle argues, it may happen that the sum of the virtues of mind and character present in many individuals overbalances the collective virtue of a few excellent men, just as a dinner to which many contribute may be better than one prepared by a single person, or works of music and poetry may be more reliably judged by the many than the few. End quote. So here we get the initial introduction to the types of regimes. And I'm not a fan of Aristotle's terminology in all cases. I think monarchy being the good form of single rule, where a good king seeks the benefit of the city, the best interests of the city, and a tyrant seeks his own interests at the expense of the city. Likewise, an aristocracy is a good rule of the few, whereas an oligarchy is a self-centered rule of the few only after their own interests. But then the rule of the many, he calls the negative aspect of this democracy, and the positive aspect he calls polity, which he also uses as a term to describe all systems. To specify, he says, the rule of the multitude in its deviant form is democracy, while the correct form is called by the term common to all regimes, polity or politeia. Seems to me there's another perfect word, ochlocracy, which means rule by the mob. So you might consider ochlocracy to be the deviant form and democracy to be the positive form. If you wanted to be more in coordination with modern language, at least, we generally don't consider democracy as such to be a deviant form. We have criticisms of democracy. I have criticisms of democracy, but generally those criticisms are in terms of democracy being the only system of rule, rather than a better system, which would be a mixed regime. But democracy, in terms of the many ruling in favor of the benefit of the nation, is a fair enough term. And ochlocracy is a nice term that simply means the rule of the mob. In other words, which group of people is loudest, most assertive, and most willing to enforce its will, usually in the form of a mass of people who have all sort of given up their own individuality to just participate in this powerful group. It's all group interests, and the most powerful group gets its way. All of the negative aspects of democracy can sort of be piled on to the description of ochlocracy. So I personally prefer that terminology to what Aristotle proposes here. But the principle remains that there are different types of regimes based on who is ruling and how many people. But he says not just the how many of the people. The oligarchy is the rule of the wealthy. Aristocracy is also presumably the rule of the wealthy, but what it really means is the rule of the best. Now, the wealthy may comprise the best in some regards. They may be able to offer the most. They may be capable people, which is how they became wealthy in the first place. But ultimately, you're talking about the rule of the best people, the rule of the smartest people. Rule by experts could be considered a form of aristocracy, although we often consider aristocracy to be a sort of inherited wealth. If you're part of a family that's been wealthy for a long period of time, and you live a charmed life because you've inherited large amounts of money, and you have some sort of political power simply on virtue of that, most people would consider that's probably the closest to aristocracy. But there's certainly the argument out there, and I think Aristotle at times makes it, that there is a natural aristocracy. There are certain people that are just skilled, are capable, are smarter, better, faster, and stronger. And those are the best people, the best among us. And those people should be empowered to rule because they will do a better job. That's the theory, at least. But then you have the potential of that devolving into oligarchy where they only advance their own interests. But he says that the many, there's a couple of reasons why the many should have some sort of political power. The first, he mentions, is that if the many don't have any political power but feel that they should, they create problems for the city. They agitate for power. They don't have power and they want it. And they will turn the city upside down in order to get political power that they feel that they're owed, but they don't have. And this boils down to the fact that they serve in the military, and so they do advance the interests of the city because the wealthy alone cannot defend the city, especially in an age of low technology. They need the average people to grab a sword and shield and go to war for the city. And those people who put their lives on the line for the city want to have some say in the city's management. And that's certainly a reasonable request. And so he says there's an expedient reason why the many should have some political power to keep them from revolting. But beyond that, he also says that there actually is a sort of wisdom of the crowd, where a group of people can judge well where a single person might not be able to judge well. Again, how far is this really from the wisdom of the masses? Large groups of people, if you are trying to get the right answer, you only really know what the right answer is because large groups of people have agreed on it. And that might sound strange. You might think that the smartest person is most likely to give you the correct answer. But if you're not the smartest person, how do you know that the smartest person has given you the correct answer? You might say, well, if all of us stupid people agree that this person has given the best answer, then that's how we can know that this person is the smartest person. How else could you really determine in a dispute of two people with differing opinions which one is the smart one with the right idea and which one is the stupid one with the wrong idea? Each of them would proclaim that they are in fact the smart one with the right idea, and who's to say who's right? Someone has to be the judge of the matter. And if you have one judge, then maybe that person is going to agree with one of them and disagree with the other, and now suddenly you have a majority. And if you have 10 people who are watching the argument, ultimately which one had the better argument, which one was right and which one was wrong, can only be determined by the majority of onlookers. One onlooker says one person was right, 9 onlookers say the other person was right. What justification would there be that the one onlooker has a better judgment or evaluation of the argument than the other 9? Again, you would have to somehow evaluate that one person. And at the end of the day, there is really no other method for determining who's right than something approaching democracy. So the point is that large groups of people do have a sort of wisdom of their own and capability of their own, and they should be given some ability to make decisions for the city on that basis. So moving on from there, he talks a little bit more about these regimes. He says, quote, Aristotle may justly be considered the originator of the notion of the mixed regime, which was to exert a powerful influence on political thought and practice well into modern times. It is usual to discuss Aristotle's notion of the mixed regime in the context of his treatment of the regime he calls polity. Properly speaking, however, the mixed regime in the politics is less a specific regime type than a reflection of the strategy which informs Aristotle's approach to the construction and preservation of regimes generally. The central practical task Aristotle sets himself in the politics is to blunt, if not eliminate, the political conflict between rich and poor. Polity, which Aristotle describes initially as a mixture of oligarchy and democracy, provides one sort of solution to this conflict. But Aristotle also experiments with the possibilities of reform within the framework of oligarchy or democracy as such. Moreover, he treats as a form of mixed regime not only polity, but aristocracy in a weak sense of that term, a regime in which virtue is honored and gentlemen play a politically significant role, but share power with the wealthy and the people. Aristotle's description of polity as a mixture of oligarchy and democracy is intended to modify the initial account of Book 3, where polity is presented simply as the correct or public-spirited form of democracy. Polities can lean either toward democracy or toward oligarchy. Those of the latter sort are generally called aristocracies, through a common confusion of the way of life of the rich with the way of life of gentlemen. At all events, it is the mark of a well-mixed polity that it can be spoken of indifferently as either democracy or oligarchy, just as the Spartan regime is often described as a democracy as well as an oligarchy or aristocracy, and thus it commands the allegiance not merely of a majority, but of every group in the city. A characteristic feature of Aristotle's political teaching, and one of the greatest interests from the point of view of present-day political analysis, is the role he assigns to the middling element in the city in mediating the struggle between rich and poor. It is not sufficient to identify the mixed regime generally as the regime that is best or most acceptable for most cities, because the regime is, in the last analysis, not merely a certain arrangement of offices, but a way of life for the city as a whole. It would seem that regimes attempt to reconcile the interests of powerful and disparate groups through institutional means alone are bound to be in some sense artificial constructs, and thus constantly subject to political instability. But what if one could construct such a regime around a group that would itself act to bridge the socio-political and ideological differences that nurture instability? This appears to be the thought underlying Aristotle's remarkable and unexpected praise of the middle class and its potential political role. There appears to be a link between virtue, understood as the mean between extremes, and a middling or mean condition with respect to possessions. Those who own a moderate amount of property are more inclined to behave reasonably than the extremely rich or the extremely poor. The former sort tend to become arrogant and base on a grand scale, the latter malicious and base in petty ways, and acts of injustice are committed either through arrogance or through malice. The middling element is least inclined either to avoid ruling or to wish to rule, both of which are harmful for cities. At the same time, it is well equipped for either ruling or being ruled. By contrast, those who are raised in luxury never become habituated to being ruled, while the poor tend to be overly humble or slavish. What comes into being, then, is a city not of free persons, but of slaves and masters, the ones consumed by envy, the others by contempt. Nothing is further removed from friendship and from a political partnership. Such a relationship of rich and poor leads to factional conflict and drives the regime in the direction either of narrow oligarchy or, given the incompetence of the poor themselves in ruling, tyranny. Where the middling element is strong, on the other hand, factional conflict is kept to a minimum and the regime is more stable and durable. End quote. So here we get the mixed regime, which, as I've stated previously, I'm a fan of. I'm a fan of the sort of concept of checks and balances. I'm a fan of people having some sort of political say in the direction of their country, for the very practical reason that people who feel that they are being ruled without any say in the matter don't have much allegiance to the system. They don't really care about the system because it's not their system. It's a system imposed on them. When people have some amount of a voice in the way the system is run, the way the government is run, the way society is run, then they feel more invested in it and they feel like they have a sense of ownership. Of course, not all people are the same, and some people deserve more of a voice because they're smarter and they're more capable. And some people deserve less of a voice because they're not as capable and they're not as smart. I don't think that we should have a city ruled by dumb people. I don't think we should have a city or a nation or a society even necessarily ruled by average people. I think that it would be better if it were ruled by smart people. That's the sort of society that will survive and thrive. And so you have to sort of have a balance of this, where the best, smartest, most capable people have more say, and but they don't have all the say. And so you have different institutions, different houses of Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives. You have a presidency, or you have a king. You have House of Lords, House of Commons. You have different degrees, different elements in this sort of hierarchy where everybody gets to vote maybe for the House of Representatives, but perhaps I think in a well-defined mixed regime, perhaps only people who are landowners can vote for the Senate. Perhaps only men can vote for the Senate. Perhaps any number of things. Perhaps people who have a significant amount of roots in the country can vote for the Senate, whereas someone who just showed up and maybe they've acquired citizenship, maybe they're the first generation citizen, they're on a lower level. They're not as guaranteed to be loyal. They are not as plugged into the culture, and there are various other reasons why someone who doesn't really have roots in the culture might be held at a lower tier of voting. And so this is a sort of combination where everybody gets a vote, but some people get more vote. And it might seem distasteful. All pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal. But let's be honest, that's just the way of the world. And it's better to accept it than to fight it, because then when you fight it, you're not adequately prepared for it, because you begin to believe in the rhetoric. You begin to believe that all people really are perfectly equal. All people really are of the same intelligence, given the same capacities, given the same opportunities, we will all get to the same place, and any sort of disparity is because of some sort of prejudice or injustice. You begin to believe the rhetoric if you just accept that some people are smarter than other people, some people are more capable than other people, and people who are smart and capable and hardworking and make good decisions and are bound up, rooted in the culture through the generations. These are the sorts of people who deserve more say in the way the country is run. So that's the sort of mix of democracy and aristocracy, and even monarchy, depending on how you feel about presidents and kings. I feel that myself, some bit of monarchy would probably be good for the country. Jumping back and forth between different leaders with totally different ideas and totally different directions every 4 years is like living on a seesaw. So monarchy certainly has a sort of stability that goes with it. Now, of course, you could get a bad king, but a proper society has mechanisms in place, whether they be through the guillotine, which is probably the less admirable option, but some mechanism by which a bad king could be removed from his throne. But there's certainly benefits to having a king as well. But I don't think this is necessarily the place for me to get into great detail about the benefits of monarchy. The point is that a mixed regime can take the benefits of all of these various systems and find a way to bring the best of all the worlds together into one form, rather than having to choose which one is the best. They all have ups and downs, and if you can devise a system that keeps the ups and eliminates the downs, you will have a sort of constitution, you'll have a sort of social structure that can last over the long term. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to wrap it up right there. I'll talk to you again next time.